Okay, so good morning, everyone. So we from #JanjiGrad, we'll be presenting today our topic. So let me introduce you to our group member, which is me, Cheok, Lock Yu, Kong Zee Yan, Lai Jia Pei, and Chong Wen Jun. So today's topic will be on biological asset. Okay, so this will be the agenda for the day. We have 9 topics to cover today, which is from agriculture to the last one, related theories. Moving on to what is agriculture activity. So making it easier for you to understand, you can separate it to 3 basic type of agricultural activity. The first one, which is biological transformation, is the growth of biological asset for the purpose of selling it. For example, you growing crops until they are ripe and they are ready to sell. Next would be biological reproduction, the reproduction of biological asset for the purpose of creating additional biological asset. For example, hen and the eggs, and they become the chicks later on. Last but not least is biological harvesting. For example, the cows being harvested for their milk. So these are the 3 basic types that you can evaluate them as the agricultural activity. So next we move on to what are biological assets. So they are actually living assets, for example, plants and animals. So you include in like livestock such as goats, cows, sheep, pigs, and fish are all considered as biological assets. Next would be the crops grown by farmers, for example, corn, tomatoes, grapevine, tree, and any produce that are coming from the trees, such as apples as well. So because of their nature, they are typically of the utmost importance to farmer and any businessman that deals with agriculture on any individual whose primary source of profit comes from growing, selling, and shipping such goods. So next to the introduction to MFIS 141 agriculture, according to MFIS 141 paragraph 1, page 1. So MFIS 141 agriculture applies to account for biological asset except barrel plant. Barrel plant will be explained further on later by my teammate. So agricultural produce at the point of harvest and government grant that relates to agricultural activity. So biological asset defined as living animal or plant. MFIS 141 is equivalent to IS 41 agriculture, issued and amended by the IASB, including the effective and issuance date. So entities that comply with the IMFIS 141 will simultaneously be in compliance with the IS 41. So we move on to the importance of biological asset. Living or have an active component that makes them difficult to maintain. Biological assets are volatile and hard to understand if you don't know the nature of it. So they are constantly under the threat of change, both qualitative and quantitative. Plants, animal, and the living thing they produce, such as hens producing egg or cow producing milk, have a period of time where they must grow or be produced. So that useful period during which they can be harvested is limited. So you don't have like the constant inventory input every year like that. So they have like a time for them to enter. So the limited amount of time during which they can be moved and sold before they rot, decay, or otherwise become useless to consumer is also a key point of biological asset that we all should know. Moving on to the second slide, change and depreciate naturally more rapidly than other types of good. So biological asset, as you know, is actually a living animal or a living plant. So they actually depreciate more naturally and more rapidly than like the normal goods that we see every day. Different types of biological assets, much like other goods, can be in high or low demand, depending on the season. They can also be loss or damage, with the loss of damage usually due to climate changes or maybe like the spread of diseases that will cause the livestock to die out earlier or wither out as well. So that's why it's important to understand of this biological asset for people that are actually doing accounting for agricultural farming activities and therefore so on. So I'll pass on to Lock Yu for the MFS 141 agriculture. Lock Yu.
Yubin, you mute your mic.
Sorry, okay. Objective of MFRS 141 agriculture is to prescribe the accounting treatment and disclosure related to agricultural activity. Next slide. So for the scope of MFRS 141 agriculture from para 1 and 2, this standard shall be applied to biological asset except for barrel plants, agricultural produce at the point of harvest, and government grants. But this standard does not apply to land and barrel plants related to agricultural activity, which is under MFRS 116 PPE. Government grant related to barrel plants is under MFRS 120, Intangible asset is under MFIS 138, and the last is right of use asset from a list of land is under MFIS 16 leases. Next. The definition of MFIS 141 agriculture from para 5. Agricultural activity is the management by an entity of the biological transformation and harvest of biological assets for sale or for conversion into agricultural produce or into additional biological asset. Agricultural produce is the harvest product of the entity biological asset. Next. Here is the common example of agricultural activity include raising livestock, forestry, plantation, and aquaculture. Example of livestock like meat, eggs, milk, and leather. And aquaculture, also known as aqua farming, is the farming of fish, crustaceans like crabs, aquatic plants, and other organisms. And plantations such as cane tree in sugarcane plantation, rubber trees, and oil palm. Next, biological asset will be presented by Zee Yan.
I'm Zee Yan, and I'll continue the presentation with biological assets. So as mentioned by Cheok just now, MFRS 141 is equivalent to IAS 41 agriculture, and hence I'll be explaining what is the definition of biological assets based on IAS 41. So from IAS 41 agriculture, it states that biological assets are living animals and plants that are controlled by an enterprise as a result of past events, and they include those controlled through ownership and those controlled through a legal or similar arrangement. They also include all types of plants and animals that are subject to the management of biological transformation. So as mentioned by Yubin just now, MFRS 141 para 5 states that biological transformation comprises the processes of growth, degeneration, production, and procreation that cause qualitative or quantitative changes in a biological asset. And then next, how do we classify biological assets? Based on MFRS 141 para 44, biological assets can be classified into two types, which are consumable biological assets and bearer biological assets. Consumable biological assets are biological assets that are to be harvested as agricultural produce or sold as biological assets. For example, livestock intended for the production of meat like cows that are bred as a food source and the resulting beef is agricultural produce. And then next, livestock held for sale and also fish in farms that are the aquaculture activity like mentioned by Yubin just now. And then bearer biological assets are biological assets that are harvested for their produce and they are self-regenerating assets rather than consumable biological assets. In short, bearer biological assets are not agricultural produce but rather are self-regenerating. For example, grape vines and fruit trees and also livestock from which milk is produced like dairy cattle rather than the beef cattle. And then next. And here are some examples to have a better understanding about biological assets such as dairy cattle, goats, sugarcane, sheep, rubber trees, oil palms, and grape vines. And then moving on, next slide. There's also stated in MFRS 141 para 5 on how to classify mature biological assets and immature biological assets. But mature biological assets are those that have attained harvestable specifications for consumable biological assets or are able to sustain regular harvest for bearer biological assets. While immature biological assets are those that are still in the progress towards the stage to be able to produce goods regularly. Next. So previously, bearer plants would have been classified as biological assets along with the produce they bear and valued at fair value per IAS 41 or MFRS 141. However, in June 2014, the IASB amended the scope of IAS 16 property, plant, and equipment to include bearer plants related to agricultural activity. Therefore, bearer plants related to agricultural activity are classified as PPE, while the produce will still continue to be classified as biological asset under IAS 41 or MFRS 141. So the measurement requirements for bearer plants should be in accordance with MFRS 116 PPE as follows. Before maturity, bearer plants must be measured at cost, similar to the accounting treatment for a self-constructed property, plant, and equipment before it is available for use. And then after bearer plants are mature, entities have a policy choice to measure the bearer plants using either the cost model or the revaluation model. And then now we'll talk about the differences between biological assets and normal assets.
Okay, so to understand biological asset even further, you have to understand the difference between normal asset and biological asset as well. So biological asset are recognized under 141, whereas normal asset is under 102. So as I have been explained in the introduction, it depreciates naturally and more rapidly compared to normal asset, and it typically measured at fair value less selling costs, and climate changes plays a big role in biological asset. For normal asset, you are actually manufacture meaning finished product, and they are usually like continuous, and they are usually static. There's not much difference in the amount and so on. However, for biological asset, it's important to farmer and individual that the product itself can procreate and as well as degenerate as well. For example, if you have like hens and hens laying eggs, you get to additional biological asset through procreation of the asset. So therefore, it's quite a different field compared to normal asset as well. So for normal asset, it's held for sale in the ordinary course of business in the process of production for such sale, or in the form of materials or supplies to be consumed in the production process or in the rendering of services. So therefore, there is a slight difference between biological asset and normal asset, and it's important for us to understand the difference between them and how do we categorize them instead. So moving on to understanding the recognition and measurement, I'll pass on to Lock Yu as well.
Okay, so for the recognition and measurement of biological asset or agricultural produce from MFRS 141 Para 10. Biological asset or agricultural produce shall be recognized when and only when control the asset, future economic benefit associated with the asset will flow to the entity, and the fair value or cost of the asset can be measured reliably. Based on FFRS 141 Para 15, the fair value measurement may be facilitated according to significant attributes, for example by age or quality. Also, attribute used in the market will be selected as a basic for pricing. Next. From MFRS 141 Para 16, we know that entity often enter contract to sell their biological asset or agricultural produce at a future date. The contract prices are not necessarily relevant in measuring fair value. The fair value of a biological asset or agricultural produce is not adjusted because of the existence of a contract. In some cases, a contract for the sale of a biological asset or agricultural produce may be an onerous contract as defined in MFRS 137 Provision Contingent Liability and Contingent Asset. Next. While from Para 24 is about cost approximate fair value, particularly when little biological transformation take place since initial cost incurrence. Example for seedling planted immediately prior to the end of a reporting period or newly acquired livestock. And cost also approximate fair value when the impact of the biological transformation on price is not expected to be material. Example for the initial growth in a 30-year pine plantation production cycle. Next. And recognition and measurement of agricultural produce. Based on MFRS 141 Para 13, agricultural produce shall be measured at its fair value less cost to sell at the point of harvest. Such measurement is the cost at that when applying MFRS 102 inventory or another applicable standard. In Para 28, a gain or loss arise on initial recognition of agricultural produce at fair value less cost to sell shall include in profit or loss for the period when it arises. In Para 32, this standard reflects that fair value of agricultural produce at the point of harvest can always be measured reliably. Next. Next is recognition and measurement of biological asset. Based on FFI's 141 Para 12, a biological asset shall be measured on initial recognition and at the end of each reporting period at its fair value less cost to sell. Refer to MFI's 141 Para 30, fair value cannot be measured reliably when initial recognition for which quoted market prices are not available and when biological assets shall be measured at its cost less any accumulated depreciation and impairment losses. Once the fair value measurement of biological asset becomes reliably, it should be measured at its fair value less cost to sell. While once the non-current biological asset meets the criteria to be classified as held for sale in accordance with MFIS 5 non-current asset held for sale and discontinued operation, it is presumed that fair value can be measured reliably. Next. Based on MFI's 141 Para 25 to 27, biological assets are often physically attached to land. There is no separate market for biological assets which attach to the land, but an active market may exist for the combined assets such as the biological asset, raw land, and land improvement as a package. Here is an example that using information of the combined asset to measure the fair value of the biological asset. The fair value of raw land and land improvement may be deducted from the fair value of the combined asset to arrive at the fair value of biological asset. All costs related to biological asset that can measure at fair value are recognized as expenses other than cost to purchase biological asset. A loss of biological asset may arise because cost to sell are deducted in determining fair value less cost to sell, while a gain may arise on initial recognition of biological assets such as when a calf is born. Next. Here is the example of recognition from Annual Report 2020 of Golden Agri Resources Limited. The accounting policy of biological assets states that the fresh fruit bunches, as known as FFB, that grow on the barrier plants are accounted as biological assets until the point of harvest. Biological assets are measured at fair value less estimated point of sale cost. The fair value of FFB determined by refer to market prices, and the gain or losses arising from changes in fair value are recognized in the income statement. As we can see, Golden Agri Resources record the net gain from changes in fair value of biological asset under other operating income in the income statement. Next. So this is the example of measurement. The fair value of FFB was determined with reference to their average market prices. As at the end of the current reporting period, they assume the market prices of FFB increased by 5% with other variables being constant. The profit and total equity of company will increase and will get a higher gain arising from changes in fair value of biological asset. Next, I will pass to Wen Jun for the example of calculation.
Okay, now I will explain the biological asset accounting calculation example. Here is the example for the calculations on biological asset and agricultural produce. This is the question for the example, the list for the fair value less cost to sell per unit as below. Next slide. First, we need to calculate the initial biological asset cost. Then here will be the journal entry for the purchasing for the 10 new animals. So we will debit the biological asset and credit the cash or bank. Next, for the disclosure for the newborn animal, we will debit the biological asset and credit the account gain from initial recognitions of biological asset. Next slide. Now, moving on to the calculate of the carrying amount of the biological asset on 31st December 2020. Then we can get a total amount of the carrying amount for the animals. Next. From this table, we can see the initial cost of the biological asset and fair value or carrying amount of the biological asset. So we use the fair value less the initial cost, then we will know the gain or loss on the biological assets. So from these tables, we will debit the biological asset, then credit to the gain on changes in fair value accounts to record the gain of the biological asset. Next, I will pass to Jia Pei for explanation for accounting of government grants.
Okay. I am Cheah. I will continue the presentation in accounting of government grant based on MFRS 141 and MFRS 120. Next slide. According to MFRS 141, if government grants received in relation to a biological asset are measured at fair value less cost to sell, an unconditional government grant shall be recognized in profit or loss as income when the government grant becomes receivable. If the government grants are received before conditions are met, it is treated as a liability. The government grant is recognized as an income when there is reasonable assurance that the conditions are met. Terms and conditions of government grants is varied. Next slide. Okay, let's see the example of recognition for government grant. Entity XYZ owns cotton plantation which contain a large number of cotton plants. The cotton plants are biological assets and are measured at fair value less cost to sell. On 1st of January 2019, a government grant of Rm 2 million for the cotton plants become receivable. The grant is paid to X on the same date. For situation A, the government grant is unconditional. Since it is unconditional, income is recognized immediately in the period the grant becomes receivable. Next slide. For situation B, the government grant is conditional. So for 2019, X cannot recognize anything yet, but X can recognize the income in 2020. Since the grant is conditional, income is recognized only when the conditions are met. Next slide. Okay, situation C is the government grant can be retained. The condition is X must operate the cotton plantations at least until 31st of December 2020. If this condition is not met, the terms of the grant allow part of it to be retained according to the time that has elapsed. So for 2019, X can recognize RM 1 million, and for 2020, if the condition is met, only another 1 million. So you can recognize the income on a piecemeal basis since the entity can retain a part of the grant. Next slide. Okay, if a government grant relates to a biological asset measured at its cost less any accumulated depreciation and any accumulated impairment losses, because its fair value cannot be determined, so MFRS 120 is applied. Next slide. Okay, next will be the presentation and disclosure of biological asset. Next slide. Biological asset and agricultural produce should be presented in statement of financial position. For non-biological, for non-current asset, they have two items, PPE and biological asset. Bearer plants is under MFRS 116, so it is presented as PPE. For example, tea bush, coffee bush, shade trees, and so on. Non-current biological assets are produced growing on a plant that is yet to be harvested, which requires more than 12 months from recording date to be ready for harvest. For example, rubber trees and durian trees means start from the farmer put the seeds into the soil until the durian tree is matured and the durian is ready, is harvested. It takes more than 12 months. Livestock held for breeding purpose only, with a remote likelihood that it will ever be sold. Trees cultivate both for their lumber and their fruits. For example, rubber trees, they are grown for their latex and also their woods. All this will be classified as a biological asset under non-current asset. Okay, so for current asset, they also have two items. First is current biological asset. It is produced growing on plant that is yet to be harvested, which require less than 12 months from reporting date to be ready for harvest. For example, tea bush, it needs 1 to 2 months only. Livestock held for slaughter purpose, such as chicken. Annual crops, such as carrot, rice, maize, and wheat. Next is inventories. Inventories, they are produced from the agricultural produce. For example, black tea or milk tea produced from tea leaves. The tea leaves will be manufactured and becomes black tea. Those tea leaves had been manufactured and packed. They will under MFRS 102 inventories. But for the tea leaves that had not been manufactured or plucked from the tea bush, it will still counted as biological asset. Next slide. Government grant income related to biological assets and changes in fair value of biological assets should be presented in the statement of profit and loss. Government grant needs to relate to bearer plants or biological assets that are measured at fair value less cost to sell. And changes in fair value of biological asset is the gain or losses on changes in fair value of biological asset. Next slide. For information, MFRS 120 is applied when government grants relating to purchase of assets are presented as deferred government grants. For non-current and current portion of deferred government grant related to bearer plant and biological asset, where the biological asset is measured at its cost less any accumulated depreciation and any impairment loss. It will be presented under non-current liabilities and current liabilities respectively. Okay, let us see how they disclose. Next slide. First is bearer plant. It is disclosed under PPE in statement of financial position. Next slide. Okay, next, according to MFRS 141, paragraph 41, an entity shall provide a description of each group of biological assets. Paragraph 42, the disclosure required by paragraph 41 may take the form of narrative or quantified description. Next slide. Non-current biological assets for agromino in plant cultivation include grasslands, which are used to harvesting animal feed, and non-current biological assets in animal husbandry include dairy herd, both mature and immature. Next slide. Okay, current biological asset for Leong Hap includes breeders, layer, broiler, and hatching eggs. Next slide. Next. Okay, according to paragraph 50, by using Leong Hap as example, we can see the Leong Hap had disclosed A, the gain or loss arising from changes in fair value less cost to sell in green highlight, B, increases due to purchase in pink highlight, C, decreases attributable to sales and biological asset classified as held for sale in yellow highlight. Those are sales of live birds and hatched and sold as day-old chick. F, foreign currency translation in gray highlight, and also G, other changes in blue highlight, which are livestock losses, depopulation, and discarded eggs. Next slide. Next. Okay, agricultural produce will be disclosed in note of inventory. Next slide. Government grant that is related to bearer plants or biological asset that are measured at fair value less cost to sell is disclosed as other income in statement of profit and loss for agromino. And the government grant recognized as income include subsidies for both plant cultivation and animal husbandry when the condition attaching to the government grant are met. Until then, aid received is recognized as a liability. Means before the condition is met, government grant is recognized as liability. Next slide. According to paragraph 41, an entity shall disclose the aggregate gain or loss arising during the current period on initial recognition of biological asset and agricultural produce, and from the changes in fair value less cost to sales of biological asset. The aggregate gain or loss of Leong Hap is disclosed as changes in fair value of biological asset under income statement. Next slide. Okay, this disclosure is just for your information because the government grant is under MFRS 120 that only cover a part of our topic. So next I will pass to Wen Jun to present the additional disclosure.
Okay, now I will continue to explain the additional disclosure in MFRS 141. Next. Okay, here there is two measurements with fair value measures by reliably or not reliably. Based on MFRS 141 paragraph 40, the fair value can be measured reliably. It can provide a description of each group of biological asset, the aggregate gain or loss arising, and it also can measure by using their fair value less cost to sell and carrying amount of consumable biological asset and bearer biological asset by group. Next, based on the MFRS 141 paragraph 54, if fair value cannot be measured reliably, it need provide a description of the biological assets and explanations of why fair value cannot be measured reliably. If possible, the range of estimate between which fair value is highly likely to lie when the farmer using the depreciation methods used and the useful life or the depreciation rate used. Lastly, the gross carrying amount and the accumulated depreciations at the beginnings and end of the periods. Next slide. Okay, here is the three conditions for additional disclosure for biological asset where they mentions fair value cannot be measured reliably. First is if entity measures biological asset at the cost less any accumulated depreciations or any accumulated impairment loss at the end of the period. The second is if during the current period an entity measures biological asset at their cost less any accumulated depreciations and any accumulated impairment losses, an entity shall disclose any gains or loss recognized on disposal such biological assets and the reconciliation required by MFRS 141 paragraph 50 shall disclose amount related to such biological asset separately. Third condition is if the fair value of biological asset previously measured at the cost less any accumulated depreciations and any accumulated impairment losses become reliably measurable during the current period. Next slide. Okay, these are the examples on how we recognize the fair value can be measured on reliably or not. The first picture is taken from the annual report 2020 of Leong Hak International Berhad, which showed that fair value measured reliably due to the biological asset measured at the fair value less cost to sales. However, the second picture taken from the annual report 2012 of Trade Wind Plantation Berhad, so we can see that the fair value cannot be measured reliably because with the asset measured at the cost less accumulated amortizations and any accumulated impairment losses. Next. Okay, now we moving on to the case study for this topic. Next slide. Okay, the accounting and evaluation of biological asset in Latvia. Let's see what happened in there. The legal act of the Republic of Latvia do not sufficiently and unambitiously explain the principle of evaluations and accounting of biological assets, the problem of the evaluations of biological assets in Latvia, and what is the solution to solve the problem, and lastly, what or which methodology used for determining the value of biological asset in Latvia. Next slide. Okay, now we look at the process of transformation of BA in Latvia in this case. Let's see some examples from the biological asset, like dairy cattle that going to produce become agricultural products with which is milks, and then going through the manufacturer's process will become milk product, and lastly will become the more additional biological asset with calf. Next is meat cattle. It also become the agricultural product beef, and go through the process will become the beef product, and the additional of the biological asset is calf. So the third is cereals, and then we'll be going through the harvested product which is grains, and then the harvest product from the biological asset is bread, and additional biological asset is cereal sprouts. So the biological asset for the fourth is bee, and it become the honey, and then harvest produce from the biological asset is bee bread, and then the additional biological asset from the biological asset is queen bees. So the lastly example is biological asset from sheep, and then the harvested agricultural product is wool, and then the harvested product being the process is cloth, and additional biological asset is lamb. Next. Okay, now we look at the evaluation biological asset in Latvia. It should be taken into account that the period of growth of biological asset, in particular long-term plantations and productive animals, is of a lasting nature, and the changes in their value, during the growing period are significant. If biological assets were valued at the cost price over their entire growth period and would not periodically be revalued at the high fair value, recognizing their fair values change in the profit or loss, the income statement would not reflect the economic substances of the biological asset. The biological asset can be classified according to several qualities, which is time of use of or time of several times. For example, additional biological assets and agricultural produce. So from here, we also can use the signs of maturations or ripeness, possibility of gaining economic benefits, so they can use based on the quality to evaluate the biological asset. Next slide. Okay, so let's moving on to the methodology determining value of biological asset in Latvia. In Latvia, preference is given to the evaluation of biological asset at the fair values, and accounting of biological asset at cost price is offered only as an alternative method. During the evaluation of biological asset, it is necessary to assess the conformities of the cost price of a particular asset with its realizable value and choose the most prudent evaluation method. By assessing which method of biological asset evaluation is easier to use, one can conclude that the choice of the method depends not only the qualifications of the accountants, but also on factors such as the availability and quality of statistic informations, the flow of the company informations, and the legislative norms. So from this table, we can see that what cost model are suitable for their usings and how estimate the cost of an item. Next slide. Okay, lastly, we look at the case problem and the solution that they're taken. So the first problem is there is no complete and ambiguous information on the assessments and accounting of biological assets in the legislations of the Republic of Latvia. So the solutions for this first problem is the responsible departments of the Ministry of Finance of Republic of Latvia are required to develop a bookkeeping and assessments methodologicals guidance for biological assets or agriculture that will explain in detail the current principle of accounting and valuations of biological assets. Agriculture company need to develop and validate accounting regulations that will ensure more efficient exchange of information between management and staff. The second problem is representations of both animals and plant in one balance sheet item. So the solution is the legislations should extend the classifications of the balance sheet item biological asset into two sub-items, which are long-term or short-term plantations and long or short-lived animals. The third problem is a complex process for determining the fair value of biological asset. The responsible officials of Ministry of Agriculture of the Republic of Latvia should create a single database of the fair values of biological asset depending on the groups of asset and change in the agriculture sectors. The example of Lichudnias is noteworthy. The fourth problem is agriculture's activities influencing factors, climatic conditions, and geographical remoteness. So the solution for this fourth problem is the responsible official of the Ministry of Agriculture of the Republic of Latvia are to develop an action plan to be implemented in order to reduce the negative impact of internal and external risks on the operations of the agricultural enterprise. Next, I will pass to Zee Yan for related theory explanations.
So I will continue the presentation with the theories related to biological assets. Yeah. First, positive theory. Positive theory seeks to explain the reasons of why the companies use one or other methods, standard creators plus one, or the standard take other standards, as well as to explain different evaluations rules of the company's value. So a company based on the rules of the positive theory can form accounting policy taking into consideration priorities in relation to profit increasing or decreasing. Biological assets at the time of the initial recognition, having brought the animal, crop germination, planting, and orchard, and each balance date is estimated employing one of the following methods, whether fair value less estimated point of sale cost or cost of acquisition or production. By employing a method of fair value to evaluate the biological asset, the financial outcome is formed over the whole period of the asset's presence at the company. Meanwhile, when the biological assets are valued at the real acquisition production cost, the financial outcome is not calculated over the whole period of their presence at the company and becomes known only when the assets are sold. And the next slide. As we can see from the annual report of QR Resources Berhad, their livestock biological assets measured at fair value less cost to sell applied on layers and breeders and broilers. And then next. And the fair value less cost to sell also applied on hatching eggs and fresh fruit bunches. Next slide. While their aquaculture biological assets are measured at cost due to the market prices of fair value at present conditions of the biological assets are unreliable, and the valuation based on discounted cash flow method is considered to be unreliable. Next slide. Okay, so besides that, signaling theory is also applied in biological assets. Signaling theory emphasizes the importance of information issued by the company for investment decisions outside the company, and the financial statements prepared by the company give signals to potential investors regarding the company's performance and prospects by disclosing the good news in the company. With the disclosure of detailed biological assets in the company's financial statements, companies would attract potential investors and could develop the company's potential through investor funding to increase the company's value. Therefore, companies will disclose as detailed as possible on the measurement and presentation of their biological assets, despite the unique nature of biological assets. And then next. Here are the examples of how Leonhardt International Berhad disclosed the details and notes of their biological assets in their financial statement, like the estimation and judgment on how they measure the value of their biological assets. And then next, the sensitivity analysis of biological assets fair value to the possible changes in the key assumptions. And then next, and also the movement of their biological assets are disclosed in the financial statement as well. So Cheok Nam will continue the presentation again to do a summary of today's topic, biological assets.
Okay, so as we come to the end of our presentation, so we list out a few key points of biological asset. Number one is the uniqueness of biological asset, which is how unique is it that is actually a living asset, as well as how climate affected it is. And then understanding biological asset versus agricultural produce is a main topic of ours today, which how do you classify between the agricultural produce, which is harvested from the biological asset. Third one would be the growth, degeneration, production, and procreation of biological asset. As we all know, normal asset have like depreciation and additional, right? So for biological asset, you have growth, degeneration, production, and procreation, like explained by Jia Pei and Zee Yan. So there's actually like a different kind of evaluation method for their depreciation as well as their addition for them. Last but not least is the cost that is commonly used to measure biological asset, which is the fair value less cost to sell, So this is the most used method where if they are able to, they will always use this method to evaluate their cost product. So that's all for our presentation, and we'll move on to the Q&A session.
Okay, today, thank you for the good presentation from Janji Greg. Now, I would like to welcome Group Splendid to act as commentator and give your opinion regarding the presentation.
Okay, my name is Atika. So in our view, the overall presentation is good and clear, and we think you did cover a lot of part, but I believe due to time restriction, you may have limited time to give some example in details, but I think I would like to add something, regarding the biological transformation, which is the process will result in qualitative and quantitative changes of biological asset that you said before. So for number one, growth, there will be changes in terms of size and weight. For example, like a cow that will grow from year to year, so the size and the weight will increase. And second, for procreation, in purpose of creating additional biological asset. For example, like a chicken that produce a chick, so the number of chicken in a farm will increase. And for degeneration, it's about reducing the numbers of biological asset. I pick example like cow, like they will die or they will get disease, so it will affect the quality and quantity of cow in the farm. So basically this three things as related to asset changes. And lastly, for biological production that are related to generation from asset, what we generate from the biological asset. So this also will give impact on agricultural produce that produced by biological asset, like milk that produced from a cow or wool that produced from a sheep. So I think that's a kind little example. Maybe my friend would like to add something.
Hello, my name is Nur Fatiha. I want to add some point as your group say regarding to the measurements. I would like to touch a bit regarding a factor that might cause changes in fair value less to cost. Since they have two factors, which is physical changes and another factors is price changes. So we see first, for the physical changes are due to the biology transformation. So, looking at the fair value year ended December 2000, fair value for taller plant versus fair value for shorter plants. So we will compare with the same date but different characteristic. So from this, we will see. Hello. So from this, we will see there is a gain or loss. Next factor is price changes. This is due to the movement of the market price in fair value. So for example, the price of 1 year old cow at the beginning of the year is compared to the price of 1 year old cow at the end of the year. So we will compare the same characteristic but different dates. So from this also, we will see there is a gain or the loss. So that's all from me.
Hi, I am Arina. I would like to add some information which is regarding to auditors issue. Based on MIA website, it stated that certain biological assets such as livestock and aquaculture stock such as fishes from in ponds are often not recognized as biological asset but as inventories measured at the lower of cost and net realizable value. However, it was found that some auditors neglected to challenge the accounting policy adopted by management with respect to agriculture activity. It is a common practice review finding that auditors fail to identify, assess, and evaluate the appropriateness of the recognition of such biological asset, which meet the definition of agriculture activity pursuant to MFRS 141 and EPPA Section 34. So for the issue solution, I will pass to Balkis.
Okay, I will explain about the solution. Auditor must document their opinion in management assessment on agriculture activity, whether it falls within the scope of biological asset or not. So, if the accounting standards are fulfilled, the adoption of the biological asset um, the adoption of biological asset is not a big deal. Then auditors should improve their technical knowledge on biological asset and also consider whether any changes are necessary or not as stated in ISA 570. Lastly, auditors should only undertake and also continue the audit engagement involving biological asset where the audit firm is competent to perform it. So that's all from our team. Thank you.